Okay, we're on, gentlemen. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. This
Thank you.
would ordinarily be our tips at 3, but this is our final Friday of the month, so this is our Freedom Friday. I'm Rebecca Kocsis from CHIA of California, and I'm joined here by John McGowan, our Vice President of CHIA Board of Directors, and Nathan Pierce, our CHIA's legislative liaison over at Family Protection Ministry, and we're going to be talking about issues that affect our freedom, pertaining to homeschool specifically, but those have a way of having a ripple effect on the rest of our lives as well. So thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen. I know you're all trying to wrap up your work on Friday and head home for the weekend. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so glad you could make it. So we have a packed agenda today. Lots been happening since our last Freedom Friday in June. We've had some SCOTUS rulings, and John, I know you said you were holding off to get all 3 of the rulings that were handed down that pertain to civil rights, I believe. Is that what you were saying, or to ministerial rights?
Sure. So if you remember, Rebecca, when we last met, it was right after the Harris Funeral Home Bostock case. And if everybody recalls, that was the decision that essentially redefined the definition of sex in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and in particular, Title VII dealing with employment discrimination. And the court basically found that, even though not mentioned anywhere in the act, in the legislation, that there was a protection against sexual orientation and transgender discrimination in the workplace. And that case dealt specifically with private employment. Mm-hmm. And we knew at the time that there was another case that was tracking that was going to come down, that we wanted to wait and see what the ruling was going to be, because it dealt specifically with religious nonprofits. And in that case, it dealt with Catholic schools. And that was the Our Lady of Guadalupe school, which is a local Los Angeles school, versus Morrissey. And those cases dealt with some teachers who were let go from employment, or not, their contracts were not renewed. And the challenge there was whether or not, well, let me back up a little bit. There was a case earlier on that said that ministers, that's what it's called, the ministerial exception, ministers are exempt. First Amendment grounds. There is no, if you're a minister, you can be hired or fired or whatever, for whatever reason, if you are part of the ministerial staff of an organization. And the teachers challenged on the basis that they weren't ministers, they were teachers. Well, that case came down, and fortunately, the court said that no, the exemption for religious nonprofits, for schools in that situation, it extends to teachers. Mm-hmm. So that was a good thing, and that was on First Amendment grounds. Basically, okay, the First Amendment precludes the government from, meddling with a religious group's employment when that employment is furthering their mission. That's how I would like to broadly interpret it. Again, that case dealt specifically with teachers, but I think that the ruling supports that argument. So that was good news. That was a good decision that we got handed down. And if you look at what happened with Harris Funeral Homes and then what happened with Our Lady of Guadalupe, I think you can probably, as we sit here today, a general broad view of what happened in those cases. Things are probably worse off today for, a traditional private employer as far as hiring and firing practices, if they want to, look at things from religious liberty standpoint. Mm-hmm. And probably better off for a religious nonprofit.
Which is what most of our homeschool private school satellite programs are, or should be. We should probably talk about that a little bit. Yeah. So
Yeah.
how do they protect themselves under these rulings?
Sure. So that's a great segue. So I think you hit the nail on the head already. And I'm not really talking to the, single family PSP who files, for their family. That's not what we're talking about at all. But if you are operating as a school, as a PSP that certainly has employees or somebody is paid a salary, you have a number of families, and it is a larger operation. We strongly encourage that organization to look into organizing as a religious nonprofit, as a nonprofit organization. And then second, develop a good statement of faith and implement that statement of faith and make it known on any websites, on materials that are sent out to parents, on the applications. So number one, organize as a nonprofit if at all possible, strong statement of faith. And still, we've talked about this before, liability insurance is still an important thing for an organization to look into as well.
Even if they do everything right, they should still have liability insurance.
That's right. Belt and suspenders is always a good idea, especially these days. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Thank you. I know that our homeschoolers are going to appreciate that bit of guidance. And now everybody's in a state of, I don't know if I want to say a state of uproar, but pertaining to the governor's recent guidances for schools. Many schools with campuses had every intention of going back to classes, live classes, at least to some extent, maybe not every day, all day, but half day or 2 or 3 days a week. And then the governor issued some guidances that were the equivalent of saying, no, you're not going back to school this year, and some very strict guidances as to what has to happen before they can go back. Nathan, do you want to talk about that? Do these apply to private schools? That's the big question. And how might it affect our homeschool groups or our homeschool? We've talked about the private school satellite programs, but also we know our support groups don't file private school affidavits. They don't operate as a private school, but everybody's concerned about this. So what is your sense? I know you've all done, you and Nathan, you and John have done some research on this. So
yeah,
I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, and so there were a couple of documents that the governor and the Department of Public Health put out last Friday, a week ago, and those are something that does impact a private school. As a private school, I mean something that has a number of families in it. So when we talk about this, the first thing I want to say is, for a single family private school, a family that files their own private school affidavit, this is not something that they need to be concerned about. They're teaching their children in their own home. That this guidance document is not something that they need to be concerned about for their private homeschool. So with that out of the way, getting into some other things where, you might have a private school satellite program that may or may not have their own campus. Maybe they do have a campus, or maybe they are part of a church, or perhaps they're, connected with, they maybe have a facility they rent just for classes. That kind of school is something that is going to be under this guidance. Now,
okay.
That being said, it is guidance. It is what it is. And that guidance relies on a lot of things. Part of that is what county you live in, and there's a lot to learn for each person. Each school is going to be in a unique position depending on where that school is, so you need to look at what's in your county. What are the regulations that you have to deal with? And you have to be aware everything that's at the state level as well as local. When dealing with gatherings or classes, in-person instruction is what this document deals with. So
Okay.
the document doesn't have anything that it does regulating online classes or families that are part of a PSP that are still teaching children at home. So distance learning or online is not prohibited in any way by these guidance documents. And it actually says that in there. So parents teaching their children at home is certainly today is the preferred, the least regulated form of education when you're looking at homeschooling, or even when you look at the public school system with what they're trying to do. In some counties, that's the only way you can function is distance learning. So
Mhm.
then you get from PSPs over to the concept of maybe support groups where you have families that are part of a co-op class, and you need to look carefully at what the regulations are in your area for public gatherings, for any getting together that you might do, even if a family is doing their teaching at home. If they do get into public gatherings with other people, with an official support group event or something like that, they need to be aware of what guidance applies to those situations in your area.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's something that people need to be paying careful attention to. And groups, PSPs, again, as John mentioned, make sure that your group has insurance. One of the groups that does provide insurance for homeschool groups, particularly that I know does cover some of the COVID related things, is homeschool insurance solutions. And that is a group that you might look into for insurance. I know I've tried a number of different groups that are not offering help for groups or events or PSPs getting together for classes, but this one does. So take a look at that.
Yeah, and Chia has a special relationship with them. So we do as well highly recommend homeschool insurance solutions. John, you mentioned something earlier in our conversation before we started the broadcast about enforceability of these guidelines, and especially in relation to private schools. Can you explain that a little bit? And I don't know if it's, well, well, why don't we talk about that just a little bit?
Sure. So absolutely. So look, these are guidelines. These are guidelines that do apply to private schools. Now, there's a difference between whether or not something is a guideline and whether or not it is illegal or you're going to face some kind of fine or sanction or enforcement action. We're talking about potential civil liability if something happens to somebody participating in this situation. We're obviously talking about COVID and the pandemic, and there the potential, not just in our setting and what we're talking about, but in many settings out there right now, is there the potential for there to be some litigation. I'm not saying whether it would be a good case or not, but certainly there's the potential for there to be some litigation over people getting sick. And if there are guidelines, whether it's the school guidelines we're talking about or any other business where there's guidelines, and those guidelines are not followed, would that be an argument for somebody to make in a civil setting? Well, yes, it would. Now, I don't know if they would be able to prevail or not, but that certainly it could be an argument. Do I anticipate that the governor or the government in some way is going to be out and writing tickets or arresting people or banging down doors wherever they hear kids reciting Pilgrim's Progress? I don't think so.
Mhm.
I think that's very unlikely that there's going to be some kind of, government enforcement. And I don't know that there is a mechanism for it. We've been trying to track down that information, Nathan and I, and some other folks at HSLDA as well, and even other lawyers out there. And we've all kind of, I think, in general, have come to the same conclusion that we can't necessarily find, that enforcement mechanism, the legal side of it for the private schools. But that doesn't mean the guidelines are not there, and could potentially mean something, probably on the civil side.
On the more likely civil side than kind of a health code violation or citation.
That's my thinking at this point.
Okay. And I think that's what a lot of people are, very concerned about. So there's kind of some bad news. Yes, it does apply to private school satellite programs. On the lighter side is that it's really difficult to say how they can enforce it, but watch out for your liability.
Sure. And yeah, that is what I would say. And I would just anecdotally, I'm not going to name names, but I do know of some brick and mortar private schools that have decided to close and go virtual, and I know some that have decided to push back their start date for a couple weeks to see what happens, and I know of others who are not closing. So even in the brick and mortar realm, there are those who have made different decisions, even in light of these regulations,
and feel that they're making because of the fuzziness in the interpretation, I guess. Is it a guidance? Is it an executive order? Is it enforceable? There's so much that's left to interpretation. So okay. All right. Thank you for that. And then I want to talk a little bit about these. You probably have heard these new terms for alternative education that families are coming up with. And I just want to say right off the bat, I love it. I love the fact that moms and dads are getting together with friends and relatives and finding solutions on their own without relying on the government to solve their problem or say this is your responsibility. They're taking matters into their own hands and taking responsibility for their kids' education. So some of these terms are like pandemic pods, learning bubbles, cottage schools, micro schools. In essence, they're really talking about small private schools, whether it's in a neighborhood, in an individual home, whether it's a group of families that have cousins. And, we at CHIA have just really embraced the exodus, the refugees from the public school system, and doing what we can to help them. Now, the important thing that I'd like to note about these is that they really are small private schools, whether they call them, whether they come up with a creative name for it. In actuality, in California, there are only two different types of schools, public schools and private schools. And so these would be private schools. So I think the most important thing to point out for these individual school alternatives is that somebody needs to file a private school affidavit, right? Because they are functioning as a private school. Nathan, do you want to speak to that a little bit? Because I know many people in the private homeschool community are getting very concerned about the private school affidavit.
Yeah, and I think reasonably so, but a number of people have been part of the private school and private homeschool movement for a long time, and they want to see it continue on, and they don't want to see any reason for a government shift on the private school affidavit. It is something that is not just a piece of paper that you fill out in order to get out of a responsibility to provide an education. And that's something that I think is really important for people to recognize, is that the private school affidavit is a notice to the state saying, I will take responsibility for the education of the students enrolled in my school. And whether you are a PSP or you're a single family private school, you're signing that document under penalty of perjury saying that I will take responsibility for these things that I'm required to teach. And so it's a serious undertaking, and there is support and encouragement and help for this. And it's a great thing when somebody's ready to take that on. But it is something that we need to make sure we're realizing that this is serious business. It's not just something you can fill out to get out of a responsibility. So with the different types of schools, you're right. There are a lot of these different ways of looking at education, and most of them do fall under the private school category, where somebody needs to take responsibility for the overseeing of the education happening. The big picture part of that school, whatever they call the school, somebody does need to file that affidavit. Somebody needs to take responsibility for the overseeing of the education and make sure that what needs to happen is actually happening. There are some that fall just outside of the private school category, where you might see a tutor, a credentialed tutor teaching kids.
Right.
And so there's not a lot of that, but there is some where if you want to, you can fall into the private tutor exemption, which is different than creating a private school, which is also an exemption from the mandatory attendance at a public school. You can have a child that is taught by a teacher that is credentialed in the areas that teacher is teaching in. So that's an opportunity as well for kind of a different version of school for children. So yeah, it's really exciting to see people thinking creatively.
Right. I love that. John, did you have something you wanted to add to that? Did you have an additional thought?
Nope, I think Nathan nailed it.
Yeah, okay, I do too. I think just the important thing to underline is that somebody needs to be responsible, and whether it's the teacher or one of the parents, but this is an important aspect of functioning as a private school. So, okay, Nathan, I'm going to jump back to you, and this may be the easiest part of our Freedom Friday. Give us the legislative update. What's happening that affects homeschoolers in California?
Yeah, great question. We've had quite a bit coming out of the governor's office and the Department of Public Health in terms of legislation, basically, but they've kind of taken over where the legislature left off.
Right.
As the legislature has been out of session, kind of off and on over the last few months, they are planning on being back on Monday.
Okay.
They have quite a slew of hearings set for bills that they want to be working on over the next few weeks. They have until the end of August to get bills over to the governor's office. We don't see anything right now. A lot of bills have died already this year just because of deadlines that have passed.
Okay.
There are some bills still moving forward, most of which are focused on pandemic-related issues, some housing issues for homeless, some low-income housing issues, some education issues with the public schools, and trying to figure out some of the complications of online learning. So as we see those things move through, I expect to see a lot of very quick moving things over the next 3 to 4 weeks. So we'll keep you posted if anything comes up, but there's nothing, fortunately, right now.
Right now. So hold our breath until Monday.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And I guess in some respect, our legislators have been very busy otherwise and not looking at homeschool issues. So
Yes.
yeah, okay, that's great. And so just right here at the end, before we sign off, I want to talk a little bit about, hey, did you guys see that NBC News op-ed last week?
Did, yeah.
Did you have about a dozen people send it to you? Make sure you didn't miss it.
Did.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I had a friend send it to me. And if you're not familiar with what we're talking about, I'll go ahead and post a link to this in our comments below. But said something. Now, I think it's important for homeschoolers to realize, even though that everything in all the headlines in the news have to do with masks and mayhem, so to speak. That's what I'm calling this period in history of masks and mayhem. I don't know if it'll make it into any school books, but that's my term.
That's not bad. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, there are still opponents to homeschoolers out there, and they're still vocal about it. We had read Elizabeth Bartholet's 80-page paper that she submitted to the Arizona Law Review, and then the interview with her subsequent to that, and just all of that. And now here we are again, just when we thought all of that had died down, here's another op-ed. Any thoughts on that you want to point out?
Well, I think it's more of the same, certainly more of the same, but I think that we are going to see those arguments here, probably more and more. I don't know if, I don't know if any of us were naive, but, we did see another one pop up, and I don't think it's going to be the last argument that's made. I think that, we're definitely hearing loud cries from teachers unions all over the country, decrying, the competition of alternatives out there. And when people are seeking those alternatives out, and those alternatives are finding success, like private homeschooling is, there is going to be a loud opposition. And I think we're going to see more of it. And I think we need to be ready to respond and have our arguments ready, and really be willing and able to engage in a respectful way, in a professional way. And I think that we need to know that it's here, and certainly none of us are surprised that it's here, but not be surprised and engage in a thoughtful, respectful way.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're not going away.
They're not. No.
Yeah. And what's your take?
Well, I agree with John. I think not only do we need to be preparing for engagement for when things like this lead to actual battles, whether it's with regulations or with the actual legislature, but we can be engaging now, like John mentioned, whether that be in the form of a response with letters to the editor, or a response by giving our opinion to the legislators, or to our governor, or to our members of Congress. They need to hear from us, because they're hearing this other stuff. They read the news. They don't live in a bubble. They hear what we are hearing. And so if they're reading that, they need to be reading our position as well. And we need to, it falls on us. It really does, to make ourselves heard. And, we can have a big impact just by getting involved, even a little bit. Each person can have a significant impact. I know in terms of legislators receiving letters or phone calls, not everybody does that. And so each one has a significant impact. Some legislators have told me that when they receive a phone call or a letter, they consider that to represent at least hundreds of other people that didn't take the time to call or write, but have the same position, that are in their district. And so they give significant weight to those contacts and to the expression of that opinion. it is valuable. And so one question I have gotten is, well, my legislator has never agreed with me once, ever. That shouldn't deter you. I heard a legislator speak on a committee once about a piece of legislation saying, I haven't heard anything from my constituents about this bill. Well, from my point of view, that's shame on us for not letting them hear from us. We shouldn't ever let a legislator on a bill that concerns us. We shouldn't ever let them be able to say that. So we can have an impact, and we should be making our voices heard. But as John mentioned, with respect, with all due respect, they are our elected officials, and whether it's by writing in letters or phone calls to our legislators or to the governor's office or to the newspapers, whether that's a local newspaper or a regional paper, something that's more widely read. Our legislators, they read that stuff, and so do other political leaders, and they need to hear from us.
So all excellent points. And in that respect, one of a friend of mine sent me the link to this article, and he referenced a previous conversation that we had, and he said, look at this. This is referencing that power and might that the homeschool community has to mobilize and to impact. And because it referenced the fact, I think the 2018, the fact that parents effectively, squelched the AB 2756. So it got me to thinking about our upcoming election in November, and that perhaps our silent majority, and like our homeschoolers are not the majority by any means, but they tend to lay low. I'm just thinking it's really time for us to mobilize if we really want to have an impact on our legislature this upcoming election. Maybe now is not the time to be silent. Now is the time to really rise up and have an effect. I think many parents are very concerned. Many citizens in California are concerned about the fact that the legislature is in session, then they're out of session. They feel like the governor has these emergency powers and they're helpless. But is that the case?
No, we have elected officials in California. So when it comes right down to it, we are an integral and beginning point for our government. And we need to remember that election day should be in bold letters on our calendars for all of us. And we should be counting out ahead to make sure that when we moved last, we registered to vote again, and make sure that our friends are registered to vote and ready to, do our part and give our votes on that day. It's something that's really important. It's not any less important just because the governor is doing a lot of the legislating right now. That doesn't make it any less important. We need to be very vigilant, not just for our own votes, but to engage with those around us.
I want to speak on that last point, Nathan. I think engaging is huge, and there's such an opportunity right now to engage with family members and friends and other people that we interact with, in the community. This is, I guess my own opinion, but I think you could have asked people, 5-10 years ago what they think about homeschooling, and most of them would not have had an opinion maybe on homeschooling. I think that it's going to be impossible at the end of this pandemic to bring up homeschooling and find somebody who doesn't know what it is or have some kind of an opinion on it. There is a renewed or maybe a brand new kind of flashpoint, talking point to be able to engage, because it is so much at the forefront of everybody's affected by it right now, right? Everybody's, looking into it in one way or another, or considering it or heard about it. So there really is that opportunity to have those interpersonal discussions with folks, and to both of your points, especially here in California, maybe remind them or educate them for the first time on which party here has traditionally been supportive of those parental rights and some of the battles that we've had. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to, educate and encourage people to get involved in that way.
Great point. Well, with that, I think we should say our farewells or any final comments. I know we've gone a little bit longer than usual, but we had a lot more to talk about than we ordinarily do. So any final comments before we say goodbye? Okay, well, thank you.
Great weekend.
Yes, you too. Okay, thank you. Thanks so much again, John and Nathan, for joining us. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end our broadcast, and hang on there just a second.
Thank you.